Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Penn Vicarage on this Monday morning. Lovely to see you. Thank you for being with us for our Bible reflection today, and I hope you had a lovely weekend. Friends, we are continuing our adventures, this time through the book of Exodus, and today we're in chapter 5, where Moses goes to see Pharaoh. So without further ado, Exodus chapter 5, here goes. Afterward, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel. Let my people go, so they may celebrate a festival to me in the wilderness." But Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord that I should heed him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." Then they said, "The God of the Hebrews has revealed himself to us. Let us go a 3 days' journey into the wilderness to sacrifice to the Lord our God, or he will fall upon us with pestilence or sword." But the king of Egypt said to them, "Moses and Aaron, why are you taking the people away from their work? Get to your labours." Pharaoh continued, "Now they are more numerous than the people of the land, yet you want them to stop working?" That same day, Pharaoh commanded the taskmasters of the people, as well as their supervisors, "You shall no longer give the people straw to make bricks as before. Let them go and gather straw for themselves. You shall require the same quantity of bricks as they have made previously. Do not diminish it, for they are lazy, and that's why they cry, 'Let us go offer sacrifice to our God.' Let heavier work be laid on them, then they will labour at it and pay no attention to deceptive words." So the taskmasters and supervisors of the people went out and said to the people, "Thus says Pharaoh, I will not give you straw. Go and get straw yourselves, wherever you can find it, but your work will not be lessened in the least." So the people scattered throughout the land of Egypt to gather stubble for straw. The taskmasters were urgent, saying, "Complete the work, the same daily assignment as when you were given straw." And the supervisors of the Israelites, whom Pharaoh's taskmasters had set over them, were beaten and were asked, "Why did you not finish the required quantity of bricks yesterday and today, as you did before?" Then the Israelite supervisors came to Pharaoh and cried, "Why do you treat your servants like this? No straw is given to your servants, yet they say to us, 'Make bricks.' Look how your servants are beaten. You are unjust your own people." He said, "You are lazy. You're lazy. That's why you say, 'Let's now go and sacrifice to the Lord.' Go now and work, for no straw will be given you, but you shall deliver the same number of bricks." The Israelite supervisors saw that they were in trouble when they were told, "You shall not lessen your daily number of tasks." As they left Pharaoh, they came upon Moses and Aaron, who were waiting to meet them. They said to them, "The Lord look upon you and judge. You've brought us into a bad odour with Pharaoh and his officials, and have put a sword in their hands to kill us." Then Moses turned again to the Lord and said, "O Lord, why have you mistreated this people? Why do you ever send me? Since I first came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has mistreated this people, and you've done nothing at all to deliver your people." And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Okay, so you have this encounter here between Moses and Pharaoh and what happens afterwards. I think the way to think about this really, and probably the book of Exodus and all really, is kind of what you might call the big picture and the small picture, the macro picture and the micro picture. The macro picture really is who the battle is between in the big picture, and the small picture is really what's going on inside the life of this man Moses really. So we'll start with the macro picture. The commentators are all very keen to say, when in this reading, that the real battle here is not between Israel and Egypt. The real battle is not between Pharaoh and Moses as such. The real battle here is between Pharaoh and God. That's who the real battle is. Or put another way, the gods, with the little g, of Egypt against the God of Israel. That's the difference. And the book of Exodus is about the supremacy, the victory of the God of Israel over Pharaoh. And I suppose it kind of tells us a couple of things. First, it reminds us of, things get tough in the meantime, but God wins through in the end. Of course, as churches, we do have hard times from time to time, and the Christian life is not easy, but actually God reigns supreme. Jesus has risen from the dead, and God will win in the end. That's the first thing. And I suppose it also tells us of the futility of standing up against God. The God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, is the God of King of Kings and Lord of Lords, Lord of everything today. And actually it's futile to stand in his way. So please see firstly that the big picture here, the real battle going on in the book of Exodus, is between Pharaoh and God. And it's all about the supremacy of God, that God reigns supreme. And Pharaoh makes a terrible mistake when he says, I do not know God. And that kind of says it all. You might say by the end of Exodus, he certainly does. And when he says, I don't know God, it doesn't mean he's never heard of God. It means he can't take God seriously. That's what he's really trying to say. But, of course, God shows his power in the book of Exodus. And Pharaoh gets to see in the end. But the real battle here is between Pharaoh and God. And that's the same. That's the first bit. The second thing, the micro picture really is what's going on in the life of this man, Moses. You see, Moses is what you might call a reluctant ordinand. He wasn't somebody who wanted to he wasn't someone that wanted this. He'd had previous trauma. Let's not forget, when he'd been in Egypt before, he killed this Egyptian slave driver in what was a fit of pique, and he'd run away. And I think he had a crisis of confidence then. Call it nervous breakdown, call it what you like, and he'd run away. And when he'd been away, of course, he met his wife, his father-in-law Jethro, and so on. And of course, God had worked on him in that time, but he'd run away, and I think he'd lost his confidence then. So when God appears to Moses at the burning bush, it's quite clear that Moses is a reluctant person. Moses doesn't want to do what God is doing. But at every point, God kind of sets him straight, okay? So he starts off by saying, Moses goes from the beginning, I will be with you. And then Moses says, but who shall I say sent me? And he said, well, he gives himself a new name. I am has come with you. He does all that. And then then Moses carries on, what do I do if I go to the people of Israel and say, they don't believe me? Because, well, they might after what happened a few years before. And God gives Moses the signs, the snake that turns it, the staff that turns into a snake, the leprous and non-leprous hand, and the blood from the river, and so on. So God gives him the signs, and then he goes on to say, I'm not very eloquent, and God says, I will be with you. And Moses still isn't happy, and he says, all right, I'll send Aaron to be your helper, and you'll work with him. And again and again and again. So Moses comes up with his doubts and reasons why he shouldn't. And at one point, you hear Moses say, please send somebody else. But God is quite adamant about it. He's the person for the job. And he sends Aaron to go with him, and so he's not alone, and so on. So you get the picture here that Moses comes up with all his doubts, but God is quite clear, and God points him in the road. God is clearly calling him to do this. So he goes back to Egypt, and he gets together with his friend Aaron, and then they go and they see the people of they see the Israelite people, and to their surprise, the Israelite people bow down and worship and get the message. And you get the impression at the end of chapter 4 that Moses probably feels, he's on a bit of a roll. Okay, so far so good, until of course he goes to see Pharaoh, and that's when you might say when things start getting difficult. Pharaoh says absolute certain no. This is despite the fact that, notice the words that Moses uses. He doesn't say, let my people go. He actually tarts it up. He says, can we just go into the desert and have a 3-day festival? Quite how they could have got the people there and back in 3 days, not sure, but there we go. But he said, he sort of uses sort of gentle language. Can we just have a festival in the desert for 3 days? Can we do that? And you can obviously tell Pharaoh isn't keen. So he said, this God I keep telling you about, he might do something. We worry he might just do something horrible to us if we don't, blah, blah, blah. So you're going to get the impression he's kind of, sort of toning it down, toning the language down, and sort of blaming God, what kind of, and this kind of thing. But despite that, Pharaoh says an absolute dead certain, no, this is not going to happen. And in fact, Pharaoh is angry, and what Pharaoh does is quite clever. He increases the workload. That's what this business about bricks and straw and so on. He makes them not only make the bricks as under their slavery, but actually get their own straw to do it as well. So he sort of doubles the workload overnight. And this kind of sets, because the people, as you can imagine, start complaining at the slave drivers, and the slave drivers meet when they complain to Pharaoh, who's absolutely adamant, these people are lazy, they can work harder. And they meet Moses and they sort of say to him, look, you might have done better if you kept your mouth shut, look what mess you've got us into now, and so on and so on and so on. And in the first couple of verses of the next chapter 6, we will hear tomorrow, Moses is there and go back to God and say, look, God, what have you done with us? You've called me to this. I didn't want to do it. You called me to it anyway. There's a fine mess you got me into. And that's kind of where it gets to with Moses. But I suppose in a sense that the message for us is that even though God calls, things still don't always go according to plan. If only they did, the life of the church would be a considerably easier one, we can follow God and do what God says, but it doesn't mean things always go according to plan. God's will does not always happen. People do not always respond well to the message of the gospel. And sometimes life as a minister, life as a church, life as a Christian is hard, even though we are following God's will. It's interesting, when the disciples got into that boat, into the storm with Jesus in the Gospels, with the storm and so on. Notice whose idea it was they got into the boat in the first place. It was actually Jesus who invited them to do it. So these disciples weren't being disobedient. They were doing what Jesus had told them to, and they still got into a storm. And actually, things don't always go according to plan. But we know, with the benefit of wonderful hindsight, that God sets his people free in the end, and there is a happy ending, you might say, at the end. But just feel what this is like at the moment, because God's will doesn't always happen straight away, and things don't always go according to plan, even if we are obeying what God says. God knows what he's doing. God's with us. God gets there in the end. But a bit like Moses, we can still have our rocky roads on the way, you might say. So see here in this reading, my friends, two pictures. One is the big picture, which is that the real fight is between Pharaoh and God. Pharaoh does not feel obliged to do what God says, and sort of see that big picture that God reigns in the end. God's reigns supreme. And there's a futility actually in opposing him. But that's the real battle here between Pharaoh and God, that God is the real God. And secondly, see the human angle, if you might say, of that in the life of Moses, this reluctant ordinand, this reluctant person who didn't want to do what God said, so to speak. And see there, and see the reality of life in there, that we all go through times like that we can follow God and be faithful, but it doesn't mean things always happen according to plan straight away. Friends, feel free to read it again. It's a fabulous read. Have a lovely day. God